Hi, and welcome to The Fault Line, a CMG consulting podcast exploring the pivotal moments where business strategy meets real-world pressure. Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of The Fault Line, CMG Consulting's podcast, where we talk about how the best laid strategies meet reality, and sometimes with magical impact and sometimes with a little bit of friction. We're going to follow up today on a conversation that we had in a recent episode about the ways to grow a business. In that episode, we talked about acquiring new customers, retaining more of the customers you've acquired, how the role of the value per transaction or the frequency of transaction can lead to good outcomes. We're going to evolve that conversation today, though, and start to get into the other things that are required to actually get a strategy over the line and have a real impact for the business. And, for that, my partner in crime, Kim Scribner, is here with me. And we've also got our esteemed guest, Kate McKinnon. I'll dish it over to you, Kate. Maybe you can just tell folks how you come at this topic.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gary and Kim. Happy to be here. I recently started my own business a little over a year ago. It come from a very large background of nonprofit work, sales work, and then sort of merging into my HR focus, both in the healthcare space and in the sports space. And so now I work with clients on building and scaling their HR functions, employee-led culture, and then leadership development. And then I do coaching for folks in transition. So new grads, former athletes, and veterans tend to be my group.
It's a pretty awesome mix of activities there. Kim's already got a smile on her face. Is there something you want to dive right into?
I'm already thinking about network connections that I'm making, yes.
We go. So, with that kind of a background, and I think there's some hints in terms of your HR focus and coaching, how do you think about helping an organization that says, hey, we want to grow? What's a starting point that you may have for that conversation and the effort?
Yeah, I mean, usually when companies reach out to me saying that they're interested in growth, it typically either looks like building and growing an HR function inside of an organization that maybe hasn't thought about that yet, or how do they attract and hire the right people to help them sort of see their vision. And so that's typically when I'm brought in. And if it's really just around growing and scaling their HR function, I really do a full assessment of the organization around why. Like, why now? What's happened before? Are you bringing me in because there's a problem and now you think, oh my gosh, now I really need to think about HR? Or do you have something in place already that's not working? And then on the other side, when we talk about bringing in the right talent, then it's, do you have a strategy and what is your mission, vision, values, and does your talent acquisition strategy align with that? And then what type of culture are you hoping to be able to build with the talent that you're attracting and hiring?
I love where you started that bit, because there's often, as a consultant, you're not sure if you're brought in to fix a problem that they're just not telling you about yet. And I think specifically in the human side of consulting, it is challenging to walk into those muddy waters at times without having like the kind of the discovery of like, what is it we're really trying to accomplish here? Are you trying to upskill people? Are you trying to see somebody out the door? Right? All of those kinds of things. So that was sparked something for me.
Yeah, it's definitely trying to understand like what is the reason that you reached out to me so that I can really figure out if I'm even the right person to help.
And where you finished some of your comments around the culture that an organization's trying to build, for me, that's a rich vein to tap into, because it's one thing to put a plan on paper. It's another thing to sort of walk the talk. And particularly in a couple of areas, and this is germane to what we do at CMG on a regular basis, the combination of how leaders behave and their effectiveness in articulating strategy, but then role modeling the kind of actions to take on, along with the execution in a go-to-market sense, that combination is a magic formula for accelerating growth. And without the right sort of cultural norms and without the right sort of behaviors, it would seem that there can be a misfit there. So the best laid intentions actually come to a screeching halt. And I'm wondering if that's a situation you've encountered.
Yes. Yes, quite frequently. I think, culture's bigger than the words on the wall, right? And we all know that, but, what I really try to focus on is culture's really built in the small moments or the seemingly small moments. It's not built in these, like, grand gestures that a lot of organizations think, "I have to spend all this money, and I have to do all of these things to really build the culture." It's really the small moments, and so, what I usually start by telling organizations is that culture is only as good as the worst behavior you're willing to tolerate. So if you're giving permission to a top tier performer to treat people poorly, then that is the behavior that you're reinforcing. And so how do we really get clear on are your values and the behaviors that you want to see in your organization, are they demonstrated by every single member of leadership? Are they demonstrated by top performers? Are they demonstrated, and is performance managed and judged based on that as well? Because I think having behaviors that tie to your values is really critical, and to sort of weave them throughout your entire organization, whether it's, hiring, onboarding, training and development, succession planning, and even down to offboarding. Are you treating people with respect when they leave the company? And so how do we really weave that throughout the whole employee life cycle?
I think also when you're talking about performance assessments and we're talking about growth, is like what in your performance assessment is aligned to the growth that you're trying to accomplish. And because we can talk about the behaviors, to your earlier point, like we can put, here's the behaviors we want to live. But if we're not actually seeing those actions and they're not showing up as things that we celebrate in your performance appraisals or awards programs that we have, then you're not going. I mean, I'm going to make a very strong statement. You will not see the growth that you want to if you do not have all of your other systems aligned to that growth.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think, performance is largely, people look at that as like the result, right? Are you meeting your budget? Are you doing all the things to keep your job and to help grow the company? But I would argue that performance is also the behavior. And are you doing it in a way that respects the people that you work with and that's collaborative and all of that? So there's two sides to it. And it doesn't matter if you're even just an employee of one or an individual contributor, the behaviors still need to reflect what the company says is important.
Well, and I think that where you just ended that in terms of do the behaviors align? You know, the it doesn't matter how many times somebody with a big title is in a town hall and says something. What makes it true is the stories that people tell one another when they're outside the town hall. So the fundamental sort of temperature check coming in as a consultant or having worked in leadership positions is to actually find those moments, and they are usually smaller moments of honest discourse. And what are the sort of legends? What are the anecdotes? What are the recent occurrences that are being shared and passed around? And if those are rooted in almost a cynicism about the culture, there's an opportunity for some change and for some leadership evolution. When they're rooted in validation, that's usually saying, hey, we've got a solid foundation from which we can do something. I see heads nodding for anybody who's only listening to us. So,
And my chief
I'll,
happiness officer just also got
Came
up
for a snack.
yes, as soon as you started talking about that. So I'm going to give her a quick treat.
good,
um,
good, good, good.
I think there's what I was smirking or smiling about, for those of you listening to us as Gary was talking, is that um, you have to identify the behaviors you want first and say them out loud. And I think that's one thing, like there's
Yes.
mismanaged expectations. It could be amongst a leadership team or a full organization of what is it we're actually trying to look like. And so first say them out, define them, say them out loud. And something we did recently with a client is we aligned the behaviors to the things they were trying to accomplish in their strategic plan. And then we actually designated behavior ambassadors. And what this person's role was to identify where they were seeing the behaviors lived and where they were seeing opportunities where they weren't lived, so that we could reflect on them on a regular basis and, talk with each other about here's how we can do better, because these things were specifically aligned to the strategic plan that is our growth opportunity as an organization. Curious what you'll both think about that.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think that having ambassadors in one form or another in an organization to really reflect back, where are the areas of opportunities, where are we doing this well, I think is wonderful. It's sort of like a sleeper cell in your organization, a group of people that, are able to really uncover and point out and call out when things are going very well and when things aren't. I've done that in culture committee work where you have, different people in different locations. You have people that are remote, you have people at headquarters, you have people at distributed offices, because the experience for employees is different in every environment. And so really also making sure that you have people that are reflective of your workforce, whether that's, a generational representative, whether
Mhm.
that's location, whether that's office, remote. I think that also plays a role because, again, everybody's experience is different and everybody, everybody shows up differently to work. So I love that.
Yeah. And the idea of a culture committee, and marrying that with this idea of ambassadors, particularly with organizations at some scale where there's dispersed geographies. Um, it never ceases to amaze me just how different a culture can feel between a factory in one location and a headquarters somewhere else and a distribution center in a third. Um, all on the surface of it, part of the same organization, espousing the same values, and in theory pursuing the same objectives. But those can get compartmentalized pretty quickly, and you can see the drift without paying some attention to it, which is just another one of those tripwires for me in terms of helping organizations figure out where are the points of friction as we try to move forward. And I'm kind of curious because sometimes there are opportunities to coach somebody into a change in their behavior. And at other times, it's not going to work. And you've got to actually change the individual in order to get a set of behaviors that will be enabling. Um, how might you come at something like that, Kate, from your experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the methods that I use are different depending on the level of employee. The way that I would coach somebody in the C-suite is a little bit differently than the way I would coach a middle manager. But the method and the result still should be the same, which is what's the outcome? What are we trying to achieve? What's the difference between what we're trying to achieve and what's actually happening now, and what's the impact? I think a big focus of my coaching is intent versus impact. People oftentimes just don't understand how their behavior impacts others. And especially as you elevate in an organization, your words hold more weight. So something seemingly insignificant might mean the world to somebody that's hearing it on the other side. So I really love 360 degree assessments, but I like doing them personally as opposed to having like a document that's completed, because I really think that you get some nuance, you can get some examples, you really get the feeling behind the individual that you're assessing, and then sort of coming together and saying, okay, this is how you view yourself, and that's wonderful. This is how you're viewed, and there's alignment there, or this is how you're viewed, and there's not alignment there. So these are the behavioral areas that we need to work on. And I think that, most people are good people. Most people don't want to impact people in a negative way. Usually it's, as a result of busyness or sort of this hustle culture that has tended to be representative in pretty much every organization, especially working with high powered, whether it's sports or organizations like that. So I think this busyness is also a big problem, and managers don't have the time to think through how to approach people in a way that feels validating and supportive.
I think earlier you mentioned healthcare, and we work with a lot of healthcare organizations, and often members of the leadership team are doctors, and their bedside manner doesn't necessarily translate into the working environment, and that can be very true. Is like we're not just checking something off a list when we're communicating something. We are impacting a change, right? And even if it's a small little thing, it's important that we treat it with care.
Yeah, absolutely. And change, you won't be able to see the change that you're hoping to bring forth if people aren't bought into it. And so if you don't have inspirational leadership or people that can communicate in an effective way, then the buy-in and the change process slows significantly. You get so much more when you have people that are bought in, or maybe that don't agree with the change but understand the why behind it. And I think that that's another area of
Mhm.
focus. A lot of times is just having that open line of communication and talking about this is why we're doing what we're doing, and that often goes missed in organizations as well.
And for me, there's a theme there that harkens back to some prior episodes we've done, Kate. We've talked about the fact that change is choice, right? And, compelling somebody to behave differently is not going to have the same effect as when they choose to behave differently. And I think there's a nuance that you just surfaced, which is, some people may not get 100% bought into the new agenda. There's still a choice they can make, though, which is to step back from resisting it. And even that can be progress when you look in aggregate at the organization, because, you know, oftentimes it's the naysayers and the skeptics who are a primary source of drag on making progress. And we talked in a prior episode about sometimes as a leader, you want to go to your greatest skeptic and get their feedback early, because it creates this sense of validity and authenticity for everybody else. And even the people who are still not yet fully bought in will at least provide the space for others to carry the effort forward. Um, and I'm
Having like that set of change champions, right? So it's not many of us spend time in a water cooler anymore, but just so even when water cooler conversations are happening or hallway conversations, whatever the new version of that is, your side Zoom chats or your side Teams chats, that there is more than just the person who initiates the change that are supporting it.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think that, even approaching it in that way and saying, listen, I like to come to you because you tend to poke holes in things that maybe I wouldn't see. So I would love to consult with you about this upcoming change to really understand where we're going to have roadblocks that maybe we're not able to see, but you can see. So actually putting trust into people by saying, and even when you hear, oh, I don't like this change, I'm not excited about this, help me understand why. Tell me why. How is this gonna impact you in a negative way so that I can really make sure that I'm understanding from all of the perspectives, and all of the stakeholders? And, I think that it just goes a long way. People like to be heard. They don't
Be involved.
necessarily everybody likes
Yeah.
that, to be heard, recognized, validated. And so the more you do that, I think that it goes much more smoothly.
Yes.
in that vein, I'm curious. You talk about people appreciating being validated. Are there a handful of signs that you look for when you're working with a leadership team or an organization that say, hey, listen, we can actually observe this and play it back as a measure of forward momentum?
Something that I tend to fall back on whenever implementing change is to always sort of take note and be careful when your most vocal people, your most passionate people become quiet, right? And that's a very common quote out there. But I think sometimes leaders mistake silence for agreement. And sometimes, if you have a room of people that are very passionate about a change, whether it should happen, whether it shouldn't happen, all of the objectives, and then all of a sudden everybody's saying, okay, yeah, yeah, I agree. That's a great idea. Oftentimes, that's really that they are not felt that they are listened to. And so it's easier to say yes than to have any kind of discourse. And that for me is always a huge red flag in an organization, because that means that people aren't necessarily bought in, but they know that their opinions and their objections aren't really taken seriously. And so you never, as a leader, I mean, well, maybe some leaders do, I don't believe it's a good thing as a leader to just surround yourself with yes people. And so there's a lot of value in having people that have differing opinions and differing perspectives. And so when that starts to slowly go away, that for me is a big red flag for organizations that something is very, very wrong. And then obviously like the normal things where if people are in an office and you see a lot of chatter or you see a lot of chatter and then all of a sudden everything gets quiet quickly. Engagement scores, engagement surveys, one-on-one data. There's so many different ways to really take the temperature of whether the change is being accepted or not.
So we started this episode talking about how to grow a business and how kind of the human element comes into it. I, if maybe we can give kind of a practical kind of walkthrough of what that would be. Like, so let's say an organization chooses, they're going to make a change to the user experience, and that's their path to revenue growth. I think if, let's say if I was the product owner and I was like, we're going to change the user experience, and Kate, you're my chief people officer, and I need you to help me because we're going to change the user experience. What are some of the things that you're going to ask me about?
So first and foremost would be the why. Why are you making this change? Are you making this change because something's not working? Are you making this change because you're looking to upgrade? Are you making this change because your competitors are doing it? Like, what's the actual reason and fuel behind the change? Then it would be, what are the unintended consequences of making a change? What are the things that maybe you haven't thought through completely? Where could there be gaps and how can I help address those gaps? And then the other thing is, who's been involved in this decision? Do you have a group of subject matter experts that are saying this isn't working because of XYZ, so we need to adjust to this platform because this will give us XYZ? Who are the decision makers, and then who are the stakeholders, and then who are the customers and clients and people that this is going to be touching? And so really understanding a full picture of the project, it would be the first place that I would start. I am much more of a like ask questions kind of a person, really to try to get a full scope, and then give them back, the things that I'm hearing and try to reframe and come up with a plan around who's on board,
I
who's
mean,
not.
that sounds like a much better approach than me as the product owner coming to you and being like, hey, Kate, I need a new chief dishwasher because of the way we're changing the user experience, right? And then you're like, cool, I can hire you a dishwasher, but why do we need a new chief dishwasher is like the most important part of the road to growth, right?
Yeah, it's understanding, and I have a background in sales. I was in sales before I was in HR. And so I always talk about this really old school sales term called the WIFM, what's in it for me,
Yep.
which
Yeah.
is you're considering what your client is dealing with. You don't get change, you don't sell a product, you don't sell a change by saying this is what we're doing and this is what you need. You really need to uncover the need behind the need or the reason why to be able to effectively get to the root of the issue so that you're able to then help propose solutions. Because they might not even know what the problem is.
Right.
That's the other thing.
Well,
So,
and Gary talks about this like very often. I have heard Gary tell the
Yes.
story of, like people didn't need an iPhone, but they needed a solution to a problem, right? They wanted to be able to maybe communicate or something like
mhm.
that. So I think the what's in it for them is we're not launching products, we're launching solutions to problems that humans have. And we need to understand how the humans inside the organization are going to solve those problems on a day-to-day basis.
And
Such a
for
big one.
me, there's also the element of humans are emotional critters. The customers we serve apply emotion to almost every choice they make, as do the members of our own team. So that clarity and some of the context that you were talking about, that to me is where the big boost comes in. And, a big part of the approach at CMG is let's make sure that the leadership behaviors and the role modeling and the articulation of strategy and how we see the world is aligned, because without that, the go-to-market execution suffers. And without solid go-to-market execution and the insights that we can glean, we can't actually tell the stories that help us learn. And the transparency through all of that, the ability to acknowledge, like, how are you feeling? Not just what does the analytics report spit out, but how do you feel customer? How do you feel loyal customer? How do you feel customer service agent who's dealing with them, right? Each one of those little human to human interactions is a moment of truth. And to me, that's why I was so excited to have someone like you come and help us talk about what it takes to grow, because all of those moments of truth, they stack up. And we had a recent guest talk about how many failures does it take for somebody to abandon their chosen solution. In some cases, those relationships are very brittle, and all it takes is one glitch. In others, there's tolerance, and there's even a sense of, you know what? Because of how you behaved over time in serving me, I'm willing to work with you to get through this. And that resilience, is really rooted in a broader sense of the user experience than just how did the button feel when I pushed it for the dishwasher. It has to do with like every interaction I have with somebody who represents this brand. And I think that's I get really excited about that stuff because I believe in the power of humans. And, I'm watching Kate's head nod, so I'm going to stop talking. Kate, go ahead, chime in, color commentary.
Oh, no, I was genuinely just listening to what you were saying. And I think, it reminds me of a book. When I got my master's in leadership development at Penn State, the first book that we had to read was this very, very thin book, very quick read called How Full Is Your Bucket? And they make a child's version too. But when you talk about this sort of like equity that you're putting into relationships and the brittleness of relationships oftentimes is really around positive interactions, and how many examples of positive interactions have you had that allow one negative interaction to not completely crumble the entire like trust tree that you've built. And I do think that, trust it's so finite in general, right? It takes so long to build and nothing to break. And so that's a tough line to walk when you're an organization that's obviously focused on profit. I mean, or else you wouldn't be a successful organization. But you also do rely on and depend on the people to see that through. And if you're not, the best organizations I've worked for have had a very clear, very intentional focus on the people that are the ones representing, building, creating, delivering, driving the product. And so I was just nodding because I completely agree.
Brene Brown in her Dairy Lead talks about the marble jar, which is similar to what you're talking about, right? You build trust, they get a marble in their jar, and then you know who your trust exists with. As we think about like, okay, so now we know we need a chief dishwasher and we don't have one on staff. Okay, we'll continue the dishwasher analogy.
I love this.
And
I could use one of those, by the way.
I know, I would love a chief dishwasher if anybody is like looking for a job. So, but as an organization evolves, right? Let's say they're going to launch a new product, and you look around the organization. How do you help organizations? And Gary, this is for you also. How have you done this in the past? Think about the capabilities that are needed and if they exist or can be trained inside the organization or need to be hired.
That's a really good question. I think it starts sooner than when you decide that you need a new dishwasher, right? Like it starts with really understanding your workforce, doing the work up front to ensure that, people's expectations, jobs, all of that is very clearly laid out, and that you have different ways of gaining skills. Who somebody could stretch to be and how they could stretch to learn. And then I think how can somebody learn to be a good dishwasher? Then you're looking at your talent pool to say, okay, well, based on our experience so far with our 100 employees, 4 of them could potentially move into a dishwasher role. So let's have those conversations with them. If you don't have that internal capability, or you want to upskill or level up in that capability, then I think it's really a go-to-market. How are we positioning this? How are we presenting this as something that we want to hire? And again, it goes back to the why. But I think that skill acquisition depends on, who has shown interest. I mean, you can train anybody to do anything. I really kind of do believe that. If people are willing to learn and they're excited about learning, you can teach people a lot. But do you also have the capability to train and teach? Do you have people that can do that? Some organizations are way too stretched and don't have the ability to upskill someone.
Yeah.
So I think there are a lot of pieces to that.
I mean, I think the primary part that I heard you say was know before you're bringing a new product to market what your capabilities are inside your org so that you're not scrambling in that moment. Go ahead, Gary.
Well, and I think, reflecting on that, I agree with everything that both of you just said. And there's an element of reflecting on where the greatest potential for a customer or a user to feel betrayed might be, and to put a sense of refocus on the capabilities in those interaction points throughout the user experience or the journey that somebody has with your brand, product, service, offers. There's also, I think, a reflection that relates here that says, where are the skill sets essentially commoditized? And where are the skill sets differentiating? And that can apply to process and technology, the culture, et cetera. Because what ends up happening, and we deal with this at times, is there'll be an organization that was once successful and is now in a turnaround mode. And frequently, what led to the success, there's still a nostalgia and a desire to hold on to those attributes. But in a couple of instances that I can think of, the nostalgia is for something that has essentially become commoditized and is no longer distinguishing. And so there were certain functions that should either be outsourced or treated with a manner that is less precious. And along with that is the idea of, so what do people value now? Or what might people value next that leads us and guides us towards the sustaining of competitiveness and ultimately of growth? And so, that I don't want to take too long a turn on it, but I do think that ability to reflect comes back to a core value in the culture. And that core value for me is a combination of curiosity and commitment to serve. Because the best organizations find the people who are so committed to providing value to the customer that they bring a curiosity that says, I want to keep learning about what my customer needs now and will need in the future, rather than sort of closing down and getting the big I know, right? Because that's the death of curiosity. And when I walk into an organization and people are like, we know blah, 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 this is what our customer needs, right? It goes right back to that selling prospect of what's in it for the customer. If we're saying we know, now you're telling and pointing at somebody rather than asking them what problems they're trying to solve. And so, as we think about capabilities, I put a lot of that stuff through those filters to help us continually optimize how we're approaching the idea of, hey, I've got something I think is of value. Are you willing to give me the money in your pocket for it?
I mean, I think there's between capabilities and behaviors, because part of what I heard you saying, Gary, was kind of nuanced in that, right? If I, as an employee of an organization, come at things from a curiosity perspective, I want to understand what my customers or clients value, and I want to understand what problems they're trying to solve. If I'm in an organization that doesn't value curiosity, so back to the culture side, I'm going to either be very unmotivated or I'm going to leave. And then you lose that behavior from your organization if too many people with that behavior attribute depart the organization. And so, when Kate was talking earlier about the people can learn anything, I think that's true on the capability side. People can learn a new capability. New behaviors are much harder to teach people.
True.
So,
As we all laugh and sort of reflect on the habits that we have not adopted.
Have I not learned? Yes.
Good distinction. Yes. Yeah, I totally agree. And, I think that then you talk too about, living your values and making sure that if innovation and continuous learning is a value, which it should be, I think, for pretty much any organization. I can't think of too many.
I hope.
Yeah, right, of course. But I think especially when you're, bringing products to market, if innovation is something that's critically important to you, then those should be embedded in the questions that you ask when you're hiring, interviewing, making sure when you're recruiting, making sure that that's an innate behavioral trait that you're asking questions about. Tell me about a time when somebody's required that you change something and you didn't really agree with the change. How did you handle that? Asking really clear behavioral questions to ensure that you're bringing the top tier talent that value innovation, creativity, and questioning norms, and making and pivoting, I guess is the best word.
Yeah.
So
And I think like what I'm hearing you say generally throughout our conversation is like preventative medicine, like be prepared so that when it comes time to make a pivot to grow your organization, you already have the data and the information that you need, right? If you have a good performance management system, if you have good insights on the behaviors that you need inside your organization in order to accomplish your kind of longer term goals, then you're not going to be scrambling, and you know, HR and the people won't be left behind to like figure it out in the 99th hour.
yes.
And part of that is this idea of cultivating change as a skill itself, right? And understanding that conditions evolve, and almost nothing is eternal in its ability to be a viable, vibrant value proposition. Everything needs some sprucing up over time, and the same goes for the way an organization operates. It's the way it was done is not necessarily indicative of the way it should be done,
Mhm.
to move things forward. And that is also for me one of those tropes that, as an advisor and consultant, that I think we bring to the party is sometimes tapping somebody on the shoulder, Jiminy Cricket fashion, and saying, do you really want to think about it that way? Might you want to consider it differently? Because again, the feedback loop that reinforces the success that we're having now can be distracting from what actually needs to be in place to move forward. And Kate, I'm sure you've dealt with this. I heard you talk about, coaching athletes and leaders and new grads and a bunch of different people who are all in those inflection points in their own personal journey. I'm curious if that's a topic that you have to grapple with as well.
I think that in the world today, even looking at AI as an example, I mean, things are changing so much faster than we're prepared for anyway. So I think that now the way that the workforce is changing and evolving, the way people have to change and evolve with that and with society in general, I think it's a much easier conversation about saying, hey, listen, like, what's your plan B? Like, I get it. I get that this is the thing and it's working for you really well right now, and that's wonderful. But it won't be like that forever. So with that in the back of your mind, what happens when something changes? Are you prepared for that change? So if you're not thinking about that in every context, you are a bit left behind or caught sort of flat-footed when you don't know what is around the corner. And yes, I talk with people in transition or people that are going from a career to their second career, or athletes going from sport to their second career, which is, this is wonderful and it's great. You've built a life with this being the core focus. What are you going to do in the next phase of your life? How are we going to adapt and make sure that you're prepared for that? And I see it all the time too in organizations where you have this top performer and they're never going to leave and you love them and they carry your business and then they give you their notice. And all of a sudden it's a scramble to like, what are we going to do? How are we going to get the institutional knowledge? How are we going to extract that? How are we going to replace that? And so it's a lot better if you're preparing for that ahead of time so that the pivot that you need to make, while still significant, is thought out and you have some things in place to move in a different direction.
It's good stuff. Kim, you looked like you were about to say something.
No, I'm just, thinking about the parallels between how we act and think about our trajectory as humans are extremely similar to how organizations need to, right? They're both living, breathing beings that can be impacted by the environment, that can be caught off guard by things. And if we have our heads in the sand, we will be surprised, and usually not in a good way.
Oh, it's a strategy to bury your head in the sand. That's certainly a strategy. It just, I don't think it works very well.
Right.
Well, and there's always, I believe that one of the constants is unexpected things happen. And the ability as an individual to maintain your emotional and intellectual footing, sometimes your physical footing as well, is one of those points of extrapolation for organizations. And to me, that's also part of being prepared for change, is not just the intentional, methodical evolution, but the shock to the system that redirects or disrupts, and the ability to kind of absorb that energy and not be so destabilized that things crumble. And there's a nuance to this, because you can't go to one end of the spectrum, which is we have nothing set. We have no consistency because everything changes. That's not what I'm preaching here. And at the other side of it, it's, everything is so well defined and disciplined, but then, a single market disruption or technology evolution can actually obsolete your whole value proposition. It's that Goldilocks sweet spot in the middle of resilience and, stability that allows for a pivot, a shift, without it feeling like it's an existential crisis. And that's probably a topic for a next episode. This is great. Kate, any sort of parting thoughts as we wrap up this episode of The Fault Line from your perspective?
No, I mean, I think you really wrapped it up very well when you talk about change just being a constant. I mean, you have to, the resiliency is incredibly important, and how people and organizations react to change and stress, which really is, it's a constant battle that we're all having to face. And the more we're able to do it in a prepared way, and with a little bit of grace, and giving other people a little bit of grace, I think it's pretty important.
Yeah. And, at the end of the day, growth is change. It's a kind of change. And I think that, to me, is one of the insights that makes the conversation we just had so valuable, because along with the strategy and intentions of here's how the mechanics of growth work, we're going to deliver a new product, we're going to capture a new price point, et cetera, is this idea of nurturing the capabilities of the people with whom we work to deliver on that. So I want to thank you, Kate McKinnon, and as always, Kim Scribner, for partnering with me on this episode of The Fault Line, CMG Consulting's podcast. Find us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have a chance, check out cmgconsulting.com. It's brand new, refreshed, new content out there. You can find all of our podcast episodes there, as well as a ton of other information and insight in the form of blog articles. I encourage everyone to go and visit.